My name is Ray Wager. I'm a volunteer at the Veterans Administration Center in Canandaigua. Today is September, excuse me, 6th, 2007. And this is part of the Veterans History Project. And today I'm interviewing Donald R. Hawks of Victor, New York. And I'd like to start out first of all by how should I address you?
What did you say that?
How should I address you?
Oh, I'm Don. Just
Okay.
plain Don, yeah.
All right. Don, when and where were you born?
I was born in Manchester, New York,
When?
November 5th, 1919.
And did you grow up there?
I spent the first 20 years of my life there, yes.
Okay.
hmm
So you went to school there.
Went to school and graduated because it was during the Depression and jobs were pretty scarce, so I went back to the local high school and took courses on two separate postgraduate years just for something to do.
Describe a little bit of what it was like back at that time.
Well, that was when I graduated from high school was 1937. You might say that it was really in the height of the Depression, but the Depression lasted a long time. And there were a lot of railroad people. Manchester was a big railroad center, but they had a lot of people they laid off during the Depression, couldn't get work. But some of the jobs were sort of protected because they had to have engineers and people like that to run the railroad. But well, there were altogether different times, and then there was, of course, no TV, and once in a while, if you had some money, you'd go to a local movie for a quarter, probably, or less. But most people led pretty quiet lives.
Well, how did they survive? I mean, if they had
Well,
no job.
Of course, they did have what they called welfare for people that didn't have any income at all, that didn't have work, but, you know, wages. Well, it's all depends on your outlook, but, you know, today people are making big money, but back in those days, you know, 50 cents an hour was a big wage. I had a wife that went to work for Kodak, and she got 50 cents an hour, and I finally went to Buffalo after I spent a year in Elmira going to aviation ground school to learn to be an aircraft mechanic. So then I went to Buffalo expecting I'd find employment in the war plants there. Both Curtiss and Bell had aircraft plants in Buffalo, and I didn't get hired there, and I even took a job with Bethlehem Steel, working in a billet yard in the middle of winter out by Lake Erie. And I had applied for a job with General Motors, so they called me one night, wanted to know if I wanted to go to work. So I went there, and I was on the assembly line building engines for Chevrolet cars. But at least I had a job. So I didn't use my aviation mechanic's license. I had a license when I went into service. I thought that would maybe at least get me in the Air Force. But I'd had some experience in Elmira working in the wintertime on an airplane with the instructor out at the airport. It was much smaller than it is now, but it was an unheated hangar, and it was pretty cold working, and I decided it's going to be like this. They're working outside. I don't want any part of it.
So, and that was around what,
That was
1940?
about 1940, yeah. So then I went to Buffalo, and I got the job with General Motors. And then they shut down because they were going to, at automobile production, they were going to change the factory over to build Pratt & Whitney aircraft engines. So I went to another place there in Buffalo that was building marine engines. I can't think of the name of the company now, but I worked for them until I was going into service. I'd had my draft notice, I think, but I gave them notice and told them I was going into service pretty quick, so I just left there. Well, nothing happened. So one night I was living with my mother's aunt there in Buffalo, And I came home from being out one night, and there was a telegram for me there. It said, if you'd like to come back to work for General Motors, show up in the morning. So I did, and I went out there and I told him, I said, I'm probably going into service in 3 weeks. Well, that's all right, you stay as long as you can. So I worked for them for 3 weeks. And then I was in the service, so that was it. But we were working 12-hour shifts, you can imagine that. We were not working hard, but you were tied up in the factory there for 7 days a week. And I said, I don't want any more of this either.
So when you were drafted, where did they send you first?
Well, we showed up in Canandaigua. I can't think whether it was the courthouse or what was the Canandaigua Hotel at the time. That's where we met, and we had some processing there. And I remember getting on the bus out on Main Street in Canandaigua and going to Rochester. We went into the Federal Building, and that's where they did more processing, and they sorted people out that couldn't meet qualifications and sent them home, and the rest of us, they put us on the train and took us to Niagara Falls and Fort Niagara.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way it started, middle of April of 1942.
Now, was Fort Niagara a training base?
Well, it was mainly a classification. We took different tests. You were classified mechanically or other things like that. It decided whether you should be in the Air Force or the Army, or, depending on what your experience had been and so forth. So, and then we were there probably only about a week, I would guess now. I don't really know. But then they put us on a troop train. And my part of it went to Biloxi, Mississippi for Keesler Field. So we went there for basic training, and that was either 4 or 5 weeks of a lot of marching, march, and taking classification tests to see which schools they might send you to if they could. If you had skills in a certain field, they might send you to school, like radio school. Or if you'd been somebody interested in guns, they'd send you to armory school. So the test that I qualified for was going to weather school, so that's why I wound up. There were probably about 10 of us that got on a train there at Augusta, Georgia. Got in Biloxi, Mississippi, and went to Augusta, Georgia. We had to change trains in Atlanta, get on a different train line, and wound up over in Augusta. So from there, in it must have been about May of 1942, we were getting training in the weather and a lot of experience working with the weather. And then I think about January of 1943, I and another fellow, we were sent to Atlantic City, supposedly for overseas procedures. And he couldn't qualify. He had eyeglasses that were thick as the bottom of a Coke bottle. I don't know how he ever got into service in the beginning, but they sent him back. So he was restricted for overseas duty. So I was in Atlantic City there. This was in February probably, and we had a lot of marching, and well, they worked on our teeth. They didn't try to save too many of them. They pulled a lot of mine. And, shots for overseas, all the different diseases they were going to protect you against. And from there, they sent us to Camp Kilmer, which is not too far away because it's pretty close to New York. And you could get a bus, if you had the night off and the money, you could get a bus out of Camp Kilmer and go over to New York. And if you do your way around, you could get free tickets to some of the, attractions in New York City.
And
So
did
we
you?
did that quite often because they had cut down on how seriously they were training. I think they were just waiting for an opportune time to ship us overseas. And in the meantime, they lost one ship there, the Dorchester. They said the one with the 4 chaplains that went out of the east. It was going to stop at Greenland first, I think, and they got sunk. And they lost so many people in the middle of winter. But they finally got us organized to go out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. So we got on a troop train there in New York City, went all the way up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, to get on our ship. So that was about a 6 or 7 day trip across the Atlantic, and it was varied from fairly calm weather to awful rough weather. I think everybody on the ship was sick except me.
I hate you.
You had to watch where you stepped, you know. But that's the way I got overseas. Just my first year anniversary of getting in the service, I was out in the middle of the Atlantic someplace.
Now, where did you land in England?
We landed at Liverpool. It's on the western coast of England there. And then we went to a processing center, or a repo depot they call them there, and they split up wherever they had a need for weathermen. Just went over there with us. On the ship there was another bunch of men that were skilled in control tower operating, and most of them said that they'd been in flight school and they flunked out, but they figured they were good material to direct the other fellows flying the airplanes from the control tower. But anyway, they had different groups coming over from the States all the time that they needed weathermen and control tower operators. So they sent myself and 2 others to an air base over in what they called East Anglia, near a city called let's slip my mind down here. It is here. Oh, it's a place called Norwich, and it's a place in New York State that's named Norwich as well. And it was called Shipdham, Shipdham. And there wasn't much around there. It was right out in the country. It was an air base that this group that I joined up with, they'd been there since the previous fall. I got there in May, and they were just operating with a bare skeleton as far as weather was concerned, because they had so many groups coming overseas all the time, new fighter groups and bomber groups. So I was there from May until August, and the main part of the B-24 group and another B-24 group from England, they went on duty in Africa. They went down there to fly out of Africa to bomb the oil fields in Romania, Oresti, Romania. And the ones of us, they didn't take any of our weathermen with them. They must have gotten them from another base, or else they figured they already had enough weathermen at the bases they were going to work from in Africa. Because they didn't take, our captain went, he went down there, so they were gone probably for a couple of months, but in the meantime, they had a new fighter group was coming in, and well, we'd already lost one of the fellows I went to Norwich or shipped him with. They transferred him to another base north of Norwich. They needed more help, so that's where he went to. And they sent me to a nearby base where we didn't even have an airplane. The group was coming. We had to get a weather station started, but the British had been there before, so we had a building anyway, but we didn't have any equipment. And fortunately, we had one man that was sent there that was a natural a choir, or whatever you wanna call them, midnight requisitions, yeah, you big go-around steel stuff, he had to. He was good at it, and he was handy with a hammer and a saw. So I was only there about a month, and this other new group, this 353rd Fighter Group, came over, and they didn't have any weathermen with them, so there were about 6 of us were assigned to this new group that came over to a place called Metfield. And we were there probably most of a year. And then they decided that the fighter group would be of more use if it was closer to the where the bombers, most of the bombers were taken off from. So they moved us down closer, so it wouldn't be using so much fuel. You know, they were getting new fighters all the time that had extra range. Of course, they carried wing tanks with all the fuel they could to accompany the bombers as far as they could and come back with them if they could. So they moved our base down to near Colchester, which is probably 40 or 50 miles northeast of London. So we were down there till the war ended. So we were coming back to the U.S. The war ended in Europe, but it was still going on in the Pacific. And some of the people at the first base I went to, the B-24 bombers, 44th Bomb Group, some of those were sent to over in the Japanese area over there. And so we were real thankful that they developed the atomic bomb and was all over with. Because I had, after I got back to the States, I landed in Bradley Field, Connecticut. We went from our base to another base down near London, and we went from there over to Wales, where we got a plane, a B-24, flew to Iceland and to Labrador, and down to Bradley Field, Connecticut, and then they gave us a month off, a month's vacation, a furlough. So by the time I got back, when I was in Buffalo, when the war ended in August in the Pacific, so that took the pressure off us. So by the time I went back down to, I went to North Carolina for discharge, there was a delay because they'd lost our record somewhere, but they finally came through in October, and I got out on the 1st of October. And in the meantime, I'd been back home and got my car, so I had a car down there. And of course, my father didn't have a car because he had my car all during the war. But anyway, we had a car, and a friend of mine from Hudson Falls, New York, and another fellow from New York City, I can't think of his name, but Paul McCann from Hudson Falls. His father ran the drugstore in Hudson Falls, and when Paul got back, he went right into college to study pharmacy. So he ran the pharmacy till he died here probably 5 or 6 years ago. Now his sons are running the pharmacy in Hudson Falls.
I want to back up a little bit now and get a few details. Mundane things such as, were you ever abused by a training cadre?
Abused by a training officer? We could all say that about basic training, and the drill sergeants, yeah, I'd say yes. Not abused physically, just pushed for all you can go, you know.
Well, I was thinking more in terms of screaming and calling names and so forth.
Well, they all used their voices, you know, pretty loud voices. Yeah, but you just had to shrug it off, that's all.
Yeah. Most units, whether it's in basic training or wherever, most units have at least one guy who's kind of a character. You know what I mean?
He's a tyrant?
No, he's a character. He's
a character?
He can get away with stuff that nobody else could get away with.
Yeah.
Did you have anyone?
Oh, we had a wonderful man, yeah. His name was Robertson. He was from Hendersonville, Tennessee, and his first name was Conmack. I never heard of a name like that. But he didn't worry too much about anything. And he had he used to like to play cards, cribbage. I never played cards, but another fellow there played cribbage. They liked to do that in their spare time. But he was telling one time he was on leave, and he wasn't too careful a dresser, and maybe his tie would be crookwards and whatever, maybe no shine on his shoes, but he was in a small town there in England, and this command car pulled up, and he says, he yelled out the window, he says, "Are you an American soldier?" He went over and he says, he put his foot up on the running board and says, "I reckon I is." So he was the character in the outfit.
What was your food like?
That was the food. Well, it varied. I would say it was very poor when I was in Augusta, Georgia. And if I didn't get one meal in a handy little place just at the corner of the base there, I never would have survived. But I lost 30 pounds in the time I was there.
Really?
That's right. The food was terrible. The mess, they all had the same amount to work with, so many cents a day per man, you know, but the food otherwise was passable. But well, with the fighter group I was at, the pilots and all those people, they probably had good food. And when I first got to that, the bomber group, I was confronted with tray after tray of C-ration, hash, or whatever, you know. They had all that you wanted to eat, but you didn't have any pork chops or things like that. And the combat crews, I would hope, did have fresh eggs and stuff like that. We didn't see any fresh eggs. No milk, but
Not even powdered milk?
no milk, no. But the meals like for Christmas, Easter, something like that, they were all out, beautiful, had beautiful, delicious food. But, you know, day to day, it wasn't much to brag about.
Now, that was because of the kind of food or the ability of the cooks?
Well, I don't know. Who decided this? What the cooks were going to have to work with? But as I said, it was wonderful food on holidays. You know, I never cared for stewed chicken, but they'd have a lot of chicken, and I'd say, "Who wants my chicken? We're going over to eat." That'd be somebody who would want my share of chicken, but the next morning your coffee was made in the same great big thing that they stewed the chickens in the night before, so it's all right. I said, anybody can drink Army coffee, can drink anybody's coffee.
Now, did you have any amenities like a PX or?
PX? Well, of course, they had them in the States, but overseas we didn't have much to brag about. Once in a while, well, we could go to the PX and you could get your cigarettes, and if they had candy, you had a regular ration card. You were allowed to buy so many cigarettes and so much candy. And once in a while, they'd get a can of those Planters peanuts. They were scarce. You didn't see those very often. But if you got it at the PX at the right time, you could get a can of peanuts. But other than that, they didn't have anything like they had in the States. In peacetime, anyway, where they had all sorts of men's watches and cameras and all that stuff. We didn't have that. We wanted watches, and they finally got a shipment of watches that you were lucky to be able to buy one, you know. But they didn't happen very often when something like that happened.
Now, what kind of entertainment did you have?
Well, we were fortunate. We were at the first base we were at. It was the fighter, or the second base, the fighter base of P-47s. They called them Thunderbolts. Well, they had a theater with current movies, I would say, that they called the Thunderbolt Theater, which was, it was nice, you know. But the fella that lived in the same Nissan hunt that we did, he ran the projector. So sometimes we'd have to yell at him, "Focus, focus!" Yeah, we had, and the Red Cross had a club there, and wasn't much doing. They had a pool table. You could go there and shoot pool if you wanted. And they could get maybe a bottle of cola. Wasn't as good as the American cola, but we didn't have much in food lines except go to the mess hall.
Mm-hmm.
But it was different. Usually the hostess was real friendly. Some of the fellows, when they had time, they could go to a horse track. When they were down near Colchester, they'd go there and either the horses or the dogs. There was a dog track. We used to go to the dog track. And when I first base I was at, where we had this severe shortage of personnel, if you had a couple of days off in a row, if you worked some extra shifts, you could catch a train for London. Well, that was all right. There were all kinds of theaters in London and Red Cross clubs where you could sleep for whatever it was, probably not more than $1 in those days. And you could see the sights once you got used to the city, traveling on the underground, and the bus service was good. And you see lots of new things, the museums and so forth you could attend.
How did the natives treat you?
How the natives? They were very friendly. At the one base I was at, there was still a farmhouse on the base, and people lived there, and they did laundry for any of the soldiers that wanted things done, and they could take a pair of wool, GI trousers, or whatever, shirts, they could wash them. They had a great big old steel iron stove. That's about all they had to boil the water out or whatever. They didn't have washing machines that I know of. But they would come out of there pressed up. They looked just like the day they were brand new.
And they didn't shrink?
No, no shrinkage, no. Just beautiful.
Huh.
But
Did you date any girls over there?
well, I dated a few of them, not very many. I had one friend that I knew, I didn't know at the time, at a different base. He married an English girl. But there was one case, in those pictures, there's a picture of my cousin and myself. I was at this base coming back to the States, and we went in there on a truck from the railroad station. I found out which room I was going to be in, and I opened the window, and so I wouldn't have to carry the bag so far, and I carried my bag and threw it in the window. Then I went back in the building, and I went down, looked at the board. It says, guard duty, D-Hawks, 4 o'clock, something like that. I said, how in the hell did they figure this out that I was going to be here? So I went down to the guardhouse, and who's sitting there but D. Hawks, my cousin, David Hawks.
Oh.
And, so before very long, for some reason, he'd been there, sent there from Germany to come back to the States. And the next thing he knew, they called him back to Germany. So I saw him, for several days. And eventually he went back to Germany. And next thing I knew, I was in the guardhouse anyway. Chasing a prisoner around carrying a Thompson machine gun. They said, don't let him go, he'll wind up serving his sentence. So I'd have to take the prisoner to the mess hall to have something to eat. But,
What, he was a member of the military?
yeah, he was a soldier. He'd goofed up somehow, and he was in uniform. But they'd let him out to go in the mess hall, but you had to watch him, you know. But I did see him several months later when I was in London. Maybe he got straightened out, but he was in London. So. Yeah, some people, they just couldn't stand that regimentation of obeying the law, I guess. Even when I first went in the service and went down to Keesler Field, Mississippi, there was one fellow, he just wouldn't obey him no matter what. I imagine he probably even got discharged. But that's like the old story they told about this fellow that he couldn't figure out every piece of paper he picked up, looked at it, he says, that's not it. And this went on for several weeks. Finally, he's decided, we just won't give him a discharge. So they handed him a discharge, and he looked at it, he said, that's it.
I've heard several fellows tell that story.
Yeah.
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 So you got back to the States and went home.
Yeah, I went home. I had a month off. And that was handy because my father was having trouble with his eye. I had to drive him to Geneva to an eye specialist. And that went on. And I'd forgotten all about that, but he was still going after my month, so they had Red Cross had a local representative, a Baptist minister there. So he just contacted somebody down to Seymour Johnson Field and told them, or asked him to extend my leave by another week. So I was able to stay home another week to help my father. So then eventually I went down to Seymour Johnson Field, and I met quite a few weathermen there, for they were there for discharge. And brought my friend Paul McCann back to New York State, another fellow we dropped off in New York City. But there's part about my cousin over there in England. He says, I got a date tonight, and he just told me my flight's ready to go back to Germany. So he told me what she looked like and where she was going to be. So I don't know what the girl figured, but she was a real nice girl. And her husband was in the service. I think he was serving in Africa. Yeah, beautiful girl. So she probably couldn't figure out that coincidence. 2 hawks is beat in 1 week, you know. Yeah.
Now, have you ever communicated with any of those people that you've met?
In England or in the service?
In England.
In the service?
In England.
Oh, I did for a while. There were some girls I met in London, nothing seriously, but they wrote to me. But further than that, I didn't. A friend that I still see, I used to see, out in California, I talk to him on the phone now, that he and I went to Scotland together on leave, on a train, went up there, and the first time we stayed together for the several days we were there. And then we went up there again, maybe a year later or so, and we had met this family in Edinburgh. They were real friendly, and they'd had us over there for a meal, and so he stayed in contact with them. So this next trip up there, he went to spend time with them, and in the meantime, back here in Manchester, the woman that had come from Scotland, she wanted me to call in her sister. So we split up there, and I got a bus and went over to near Glasgow to visit this woman, and I spent one night over there at her place. But George Kaysen, this friend of mine in California, he's still in touch with the family up in Edinburgh. He stayed in touch with them. Whether they're children now or grandchildren of the people that were there in the 1943 or 4, you know. But the personnel that I worked with at the Army, I was in touch with 3 of them, and 2 of them have died now. So. But I was pretty close to all those people in the pictures while they were in the service. And it was one from New York City that I kept in contact with for a while. As in the meantime, I'd taken a job. I went back to work for Chevrolet, and they were only working 3 days a week because they didn't have the parts. I was trying to get started up. They'd been on strike when I got home from the service. And so I had applied for the Weather Bureau. Unfortunately, a job turned up in Buffalo where I was living, because they had mostly women working there during the war, and some of them were getting tired of it, and one of them wanted to go back to school, I guess. Anyway, they had an opening for me in Buffalo. So I took a job there in July of 1946. Oh, before that, when we couldn't get a job anywhere because this place had been on strike, they had a club they called 5220 for veterans. So I joined the club. So I guess they got $20 a week for 52 weeks if you were out of work that long.
Yeah.
But eventually I got this job with the Weather Bureau, and it was much better than working for Chevrolet because I didn't get any vacations with Chevrolet. And the government job, the U.S. government, even starting out, you're still going to get 30 days vacation a year. And you had 13 days of sick leave. You know, it was a pretty good job, except for the hours. Of course, I was used to that, working different shifts. But the Weather Bureau went on 24 hours a day, just like the Air Force weather did. So I stuck with them for 30 years.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, almost 30 years. I had 9 years at Buffalo and 20 years at Rochester. So that worked out well. I wanted to get to Rochester because the woman that I eventually married, she was working at Kodak. So,
I was going to ask you, somewhere along in here you got married. How did you meet her?
well, I was real fortunate. My cousin, a brother to this one I met in England, he was going with this woman, and they invited me, and he was my cousin, and I invited a cousin of his girlfriend. So we got together that night at her place, I guess. And we had supper, as I recall, and I knew right away this was the one I was looking for. Just like that.
Really?
That's right, you know. So we got along real well, and got married. Eventually had a beautiful son, and my poor wife died from the effects of childbirth. The doctors goofed up. She had peritonitis, and they didn't realize it. They sent her home. So I lost a wife. So that was a coincidence. Cousins marrying cousins, and everybody was happy.
Yeah. So did you eventually remarry?
Pardon?
Did you eventually remarry?
Oh, yeah, I was real fortunate in considering the circumstances, because my first wife, she took over my baby son and took care of him for 2 years, she and her family, the oldest sister. And there was, in his family, there were 10 kids altogether. 6 of them were girls. Anyway, I married one of them, And then the father used to kid that kid, I suppose he did, with his friends. They would tell him how lucky he was to have all these daughters. And, well, he says, the best three are left. So, for a while I didn't dare tell any of them after the best three were left, but anyway, one of them married me, so I had another wife. So she took over my 2-year-old son and raised him just like her own. And that was beautiful, you know.
And did you have any more children?
We had one more, yeah, we had another son together, and he's the one that plays, or has the father of the soccer players now.
Hmm.
The oldest son, we are very unfortunate. He'd been to Camp Kilmer, not Kilmer, the Boy Scout camp in New Mexico.
Oh. Yeah.
Come on, I got it. Well, anyway, he'd been down there for a month. And he came home and he'd taken a bunch of pictures. And one morning he says, I'm going down to see so-and-so. I want to see him. So I had to go to work in the afternoon, so I loaded his bicycle to the back of the station wagon and drove it down to see his friend. And on the way home, he got hit by a car. So that was kind of tough. Yeah. 14 years old. Yeah. So it's been a great life, a lot of rough places, but I've been fortunate in a way, having this wife for 45 years, but married to this one. First one was 7.5.
Hmm.
And they were both real happy. Yeah.
That seems kind of rare these days.
Marriages, you mean?
Kind of rare for them to be happy and long.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, we've had people ask you, how can you stay married so long, you know? Well, that's not very long when you had a father and mother that were married 64 years. You know. It rubs off on you, I think.
Yeah.
If you have, your parents have happy marriages,
Yes.
you know.
Yeah.
How about you? You have a family?
Mhm. I can talk to you later about it. There was something else I wanted to ask you. Oh, two things. As you think back about your military experience, was there anything outstanding that you felt
Back at what experience?
during your time in the military?
Yeah.
Was there any event or anything that happened to you that you feel had an impact on the rest of your life?
No, I don't think so.
Some fellows will say, well, yeah, it was a discipline. Some guys will say, yeah, I learned how to make friends.
Mm-hmm.
Things like that, you know, nothing really major. The other question is, do you belong to any of the veterans organizations?
I belong to the American Legion and I'm a life member of the Disabled Americans.
Are you?
Yes.
But you didn't get the Purple Heart.
No, this was line of duty, service connected, yes. And one of them was for an injury to my intestines or the colon or bowel that they said was probably, might have been something in you ate that ate a hole to your colon and it come out to the buttocks. In other words, you had two rectums or two anuses. So anyway, I got 10% connection with that. So, I had another thing that I just got settled within the last couple of months. before I went overseas in Atlantic City, I had a leg injury. My right leg, I got injured. We were out on playing soccer for physical therapy, and I got kicked. This was in the middle of winter, January or February, cold weather, and they had some very cold weather in Atlantic City that particular year. But anyway, I had it on my record that I had a leg injury, and it just gotten a little bit worse through the years, and I was here at the VA one day seeing Dr. Joshi, if you know him, Joshi, whatever they call him, and I said, I want to get some new support stockings. I said, I got service connection. And he says, it doesn't show on my computer. So that got me all excited. I said, well, I got the paperwork. I got printed matter right out of Buffalo office from 1947 saying that I had a service connection for a right leg injury. I got another one in 1974 saying that it still continues service connected for your right leg. So then I got the DAV to go to bat for me. So they had a guy sitting with a van out in front of the hospital here. And I come up to go to that, and it was a terrible windy day this past spring sometime. And well, he says, the way we'll go at this, he says, we'll just ask for an increase in compensation and see what happens. Well, first I thought, well, they probably would call me in, and they wanted to see my papers. I gave him the copies of the papers that I had from the VA in Buffalo and Rochester. So they finally called me in to Rochester for a compensation hearing or rating. So they examined me up there at Westfall Road, and so they decided that it was worth 10% more compensation. So that's the way I got service connection. So I didn't, you know, I was around England there where you could have been hurt. You know, there were a few buzz bombs going over, and one day there was a whole flight of planes. They weren't all the same planes, but they were coming back from the continent, and they weren't very high. And we were standing there by our barracks because they made so much noise because there were so many of them down so low. And one of them, whether something got in his way, they were flying too close together, but he came down and he hit in a wheat field and bounced off the wheat field, and he went through a Nissen hut, and the wreckage just stopped by another hut probably 100 feet away from where we were. You know, anybody that had been in that hut, they would have been done, you know. But those buzz bombs that were flying over, sometimes you wouldn't see any or hear any, but they would send them over at night. By hearing was much better then, but you just lay there and listen. If you heard them, if the motor stopped, you decided, well, I'd get out and lay on the floor. That's about as good as I could do. But yeah, things like that, you just think that you try to be careful and do the best you can, you know.
Yeah. Not much else you can do.
No. And one fellow, this friend of mine, he was coming back from London on a train one time, and he was in one of those passenger cars, and just for no reason at all, he got up and moved up to a car that's up ahead, and they stopped somewhere and got run into in the back end of the train, you know, and he probably was fortunate that he moved, you know.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I've been pretty fortunate, I think.
Now, how long ago did you retire?
Well, I hate to think it was that long ago. 1974.
Wow.
I had enough time in. I had my 30 years in, and I was going to be 55 and the 5th of November, 1974. And my poor son that we lost, he was killed on August 13th, just 3 months before I was going to retire. So somehow I stayed in there till I was 55. I made it till November, and I was out. I'd had all I wanted.
Yeah.
Because if I hadn't had to go to work that afternoon, he never would have had his bicycle. I would have taken him down there and picked him up both. Yeah, and they were both, he was with his friend, and he were both coming to Victor on their bicycles. They were on the right side of the road, on the you know, off the pavement. And this lady was headed to Victor, going east. And there's a slight curve there, and she started to go around the curve and kept right on going, hit both of them. And his friend, I don't know, he got hurt real bad. I don't think he was ever right after that. And his family, they were living down in Farmington, and they felt so badly about it. I don't know what other reason, but they picked up and moved back east somewhere where they came from. But that's why I decided, well, I was looking forward to retirement right along, you know, but it just happened that way, that I had to wait 3 months after my son was killed before I could get the age requirement,
Yeah.
55. But it's been pretty good. I don't know where the time's gone, because people say, well, you're not working. What do you do with your time? Well, I don't have any problem with that. Now, we did quite a bit of traveling when I was younger. We go, because my wife's sister had moved to Tucson, Arizona in 1952, the year I was first married. So we spent almost every year, after I retired, we'd drive out to Arizona and maybe go again in the wintertime on a plane, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So there was always something, and up until, well, we had a cottage on Canandaigua Lake that my father and grandfather and my uncle, plus a carpenter, had built around 1920, I guess. So that was in the family all those years, and after my grandfather and grandmother died, it belonged to my dad and mother and his brother and wife, and eventually they sold it. They just turned it over to my brother and me and my 2 cousins. Well, then in 1978, that was only 4 years after my son was killed, we decided that for the short season, it wasn't worth all the work that goes into, and this, you could live there the year round, really, a lakefront property. And taxes, we thought they were bad then, but from what I read in the paper, they're impossible now. People from Gorham, and maybe they don't pay any school taxes, I don't know. We paid a lot of taxes for a place that's only in use 3 months a year or something like that. So we sold it. But before that, we'd spend at least a week or 2 at the lake, you know, with the 2 families.
Mm-hmm.
4 families, but I mean, that cuts it down pretty short too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to add before we close up?
No, I can't think so, Ray. No.
Well, I want to thank you very much. I appreciate you coming out.
Yeah. Well, it's people like you that keep things going, you know.
Yeah.
You said it was going on all over the country.
Yes.
But I was telling my brother-in-law out in Parma the other day, they invited us out there for lunch. And he said his daughter was there from New Mexico, and she had us set up with a camera, recording facilities, and was asking him all about his service. And so he was surprised. Well, I says, I don't know. I says, the fellow that's got me set up, he says it's going on all over the country, but this was his daughter that was doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's good.